When you feel it's hopeless, when you think that you lost, oh, I will take your hand and we'll rise up from the dust. Oh, here we go, 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 let us heal and grow. You won't be alone, we're unstoppable. Don't be afraid to show what we're going for. This is what we know. Here we come back to life, we're still breathing. Standing up, everybody's gonna see it. Oh, all you need to know is that we're holding on. Even if we fall, we will rise up and we follow the path that we believe in. No, we're not gonna stop until we reach it. Oh, all you need to know is that we're holding on. We rise up from the dust and clean my throat.
Hey, welcome everybody to Life to the Full podcast. I am your host with the most, Jimmy Z, otherwise known as the Unbound Scholar. We're inviting you all to our Friday Shabbat, although we have much more lights on than we usually do. We actually managed to have a Shabbat, which is not every week. It's not every week. We would like it to be every week, but it's not every week. We got some wine getting ready to go. I have some bread and some cheese, although I'm not sure if I'm going to eat any of that because I'm pretty full. I'm going to invite in my beautiful wife, beautiful, smart, intelligent, brave, kind, compassionate, Patricia Kelly Zito. Patty.
Compassionate.
Well, I'm speaking your truth into existence.
Thank you for the compassionate, honey.
Yeah. You know, what's better than, wine, cheese, bread, Bible time with your beautiful, significant other. First, we're going to go through quickly the New Testament by the numbers because, you really want to know what's in your New Testament. So when you're trying to figure out like where to start and what to look at, it's a good idea. So I created this handy dandy little chart. You guys know me in charts. So if you go through it, you really see the majority of what is in your New Testament is going to be the Gospels. So you have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, right? And then the next kind of big bit would be Acts of the Apostles, as we're going to talk about. And then you have the writings of Paul. And then you have, some letters from John, James, Peter, and you have, the book of Revelation. So you kind of have all this stuff arranged. And the way that it's mostly been arranged in the Bibles that we've been given, it doesn't necessarily reflect or showcase how these things were put together or who preserved them. It's kind of more, I feel like it's a very Western thing to do where we want to quantify, we want to qualify, we want to categorize things. This is a plant, this is an animal. So the Gospels are kind of like, okay, here are some, they'll call them eyewitness accounts, or you can go into the Greek, the evangelion, or the good news, right? So you have different accounts of the life of Jesus, right? And that'll be at the top of your New Testament. You have Matthew, and I feel like Matthew is kind of put first because Matthew has kind of had, I would say, an outsized influence in the whole Christian story. If you go and you read the Didache, which is like, I think actually more like a third or fourth century, I'm not really sure now, I'm gonna look that up, manual it's kind of like a little tract, it definitely from when people were becoming Christians back in the day, which that would actually be something really cool and fun to do for the summer series as well. Matthew kind of has an outsized influence there. It's quoted pretty much extensively. But, Mark is considered nowadays to be the earliest gospel. So you read Matthew, you get to Mark, then you get to Luke, and then you get to John. And so those would be like your accounts of Jesus. And then after that, you get like what some people would consider the only history in the Bible, which would be the book of Acts. And the book of Acts is, from one point of view, it's like historical. Okay. It's kind of, I think mainstream Christianity would say this is, basically the history of the early church. And then you get through the letters of Paul. And I would say that the letters of Paul probably have a way more outsized influence on Christianity today than even the Gospel of Matthew. Because Paul, on the face of it, seems so quotable. And and then you have the rest of the letters, and you have the book of Revelation, and everyone kind of is like, we kind of put that at the end. We're like, no one really knows what to do with that. Some strange stuff seems to be happening. And I circled Matthew, Mark, and Luke for you there if you're watching the slide deck. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are what we would call the synoptics. They are basically, they have a lot of similarities. So the basic story today is that Mark came first, and then Matthew and Luke both used Mark and other sources. So that's something that most people would agree with today. And then you have the Gospel of John, which seems to be its own crazy thing. And then you have the Book of Acts. Now, the interesting thing about the Book of Acts, though, is that the Book of Acts, and most people don't know this, or they're not aware of this, they don't think of this, is that the book of Luke and Acts are actually connected. So basically, whoever wrote Luke, after he finished writing what we call the Gospel of Luke, picked up another parchment or whatever he was writing with, and he immediately started on the book of Acts. So Luke and Acts are connected. They are connected somehow. They're, in my opinion, the person who wrote this was expecting you to read Luke and then pick right up with Acts, whatever he called it. We can call it volume 1 and volume 2. It's kind of like two parts of one whole. So if you have a series of movies, right, that have maybe, I can't think, usually movies are in threes. I don't know why that is, but if you think about something that's supposed to have two parts, you wouldn't just read or watch one part and then just leave, right? You wouldn't watch half of Star Wars and then just leave the theater, right? You wouldn't watch just half of whatever movie you're watching and just be like, that's great, that's enough, and then go away and maybe only read that at some point. So yeah, these two things are connected. And then if you think about it that way, and now here I organized the New Testament by scriptural communities. I hope I spelled that right. Scriptural communities. I always want to say spiritual. It's kind of like a thing that happens. But if you organize it by scriptural communities, you can see that these documents were preserved by people that they did value these books. They valued these works, especially as the people who wrote them began to die off. But they come from communities that, as well as what we would call the Old Testament, which they would call maybe just the scriptures, or they would call the Hebrew Bible or the Tanakh, as we would say today. That was really the Bible of the church for hundreds of years. But there were these spiritual communities that they did have these documents, and that they did cherish them. And we know that they cherish them because we have them. If there weren't people copying these things don't last forever. We wouldn't have these things today. And then if you look at Luke and Acts together, okay, Luke and Acts could reflect a Pauline, or these were the descendants of Paul's churches. Maybe there are some problems with that we'll get to, if not today, at some point, where people have kind of they're not sure, is Luke and Acts connected to Paul and his epistles, or is it representative of some other type of community, maybe from Rome? But Luke and Acts together, they kind of take over a majority portion of the New Testament, and no other real book or no other real scriptural community has as big of a footprint as Luke and Acts does. So when all these things are being brought together, and we're only going to really be sketching this out in the broadest strokes, because that's a whole other crazy and fascinating story that we're definitely not going to get into today, of how all these books came together. And so much of it we don't know. Much of it is guesswork. But that community itself, with the amount of text, the amount of words, the footprint that it contributed to Christianity, is, I think, something together that most of the times we're not really aware of. We're not really giving it a lot of thought. So Luke and Acts, especially when now we divorce Acts from Luke, and Luke is its thing and Acts is its thing. And as we'll see as we go through this, there's a lot of interplay between the two books, So the two books definitely, they expect that you know your Hebrew scriptures. They expect that you know the Tanakh, but they also expect that you know each other, because they do talk about each other. They do they don't necessarily talk about each other, but they do reference each other. And there's a lot of intertextuality that's going on between Luke and Acts. That's why for me, if I was going to arrange a Bible, and I don't think anyone is ever going to ask me to do it, I would arrange the Bible more by scriptural communities. I don't know if that thing is actually out there. I feel like you could probably make a really cool product if you did that. But I would arrange my New Testament more based on scriptural community versus, Matthew, Mark, Luke, Acts, and then all the letters, and then Revelation. So that's there. So Paul's letters, and if you take Luke and Acts, and you also assume that now, they're also connected to the letters of Paul, you get a huge outsized influence that this Pauline community, or this community that descended from Paul and his churches, had on basically Christianity today. So Lucan communities, a whopping 27.5 or about 28% of the New Testament comes just from Luke and Acts alone. If you combine that with Paul's letters, that's 23.4. That's close to 50%. It's close to 50% of the New Testament influenced by Paul, or like the Pauline tradition, if you take them as combined. So this is Monument Valley in Arizona. It's a sacred valley of the Navajo. You can look it up on its Wikipedia page. It's really cool. It's been on my bucket list, a place to go. And here you kind of see a beautiful, kind of desert night. There's a lot of really cool rock formations out here. Right now, I believe we're looking from the south. So we would be, if this was like we were really there, we'd be south of this structure. And you can see two of the rock formations are called mittens. They kind of look like mittens because they kind of look like hands, right? You see the little thumbs, right? So you have on the left side, you have the western mitten. Yep. And then in the middle, you have the eastern mitten. And then you have Merrick Butte, Butte, not Merrick Butt. Okay. Butte. It would always be fun when I taught kids. They'd always be like, that says, you just didn't want to say butt. No, it's Butte, Butte. I think it's another language too. So who knows how it's really pronounced. So together, all three of these.
They look like tree trunks to me.
They look like tree trunks to you? Okay.
Mhm.
Yeah. What makes you say they look like tree trunks?
If I look at it closely. And then the thing on the left side looks like building for me.
You mean like on the right side, or so one of the mittens?
Yep.
Looks kind of like a building.
Mm-hmm.
So it'd be cool. It'd be cool to go check. We could go there and we can knock on the rock, see if we can find any doors.
Well, I will have a really challenging time listening to what they're gonna tell me what it is.
It's a park. You could just go and just walk around.
Yeah, I could do that.
I
love that.
We'd have to be prepared. It's a little dangerous. We need to bring like water and food and make sure we have a
What
good
makes
car.
it dangerous?
Because it's a desert, so you want to be careful. And it's a park, so it's just a lot of times it's just like roads.
Mm-hmm.
And to access some of this stuff, it's just trails. So if you remember, like some of the trails we did in Arizona, if you can imagine having to walk way, way far away from your car to get to some of these places, but you can see a nice road in kind of the middle. So, but I've even seen, because I know this has been in some of the videos you showed me too, that there's like, I guess we might be standing on it here, but there's like things that almost look like walls, or like, giant like walls or old dams that might have been there, so yeah, so it's cool. But I put this, I use this because together all three paint a great illustration of the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts. So if you kind of want to see the one on the left, if you draw a circle around that could symbolize the Gospel of Luke, right? So you can kind of see that nice big circle there, and it kind of takes in both of the mittens. It takes on the rock formation on the left and the one in the middle, and then you have Book of Acts, which is right there, and that kind of also is the one on the far right, and also kind of captures the one in the middle. So I put it like that because Luke kind of ends with the resurrection, and Acts begins with the resurrection. So you can kind of see there, Luke and Acts. I've kind of done that so you can see visually how they're both connected. So there's something that the end of Luke covers, that the beginning of Acts kind of backs up a little bit, like a good TV show. On a second season, you'll get maybe that recap. So Luke 1, it's like season 1, Luke, the book of Luke, the gospel, and then you have Acts. So you have the text of Luke, you have the text of Acts. And it's also something to note that none of these books in the Bible are given like names. So like Matthew doesn't come to us the gospel according to Matthew. It's something that traditionally these names have been assigned. Same thing of Luke and Acts. Acts of the Apostles is actually kind of strange, in one sense, because the only apostle that's really mentioned there is Peter and Paul. And in the book of Acts, Paul it's not really made a big deal that he is an apostle the way it is like in his letters. That's just a little tidbit to throw out there. So the Gospel of Luke can be broken up into 3 main sections. Let me get that up there. Well, first I'm going to go through this. So the book of Luke, Acts together, and a lot of people nowadays, they hyphenate that just to show the interconnectedness of Luke and Acts. So Luke Acts does presume that you are intimately familiar with one set of texts, and that is, of course, the Hebrew Scriptures. So I'm going to go through that real quick. We have Genesis 1 through 11. We have the Torah, which is Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And then going out, we have the prophets. It's like I put this handy dandy chart there for you, just in case you're not familiar with the Jewish order text, which I think that's the same ordering as we'll see even from internal clues from let's say Luke 24 on the road of Emmaus, where Jesus kind of like talks in ways that you can see that he has this in mind as well. And then we have the writings, which kind of is often named for its biggest part, which is the Psalms. And then you have that. So whoever wrote Luke Acts is thinking that you're intimately familiar with all these texts. So that's something too that we could consider doing, kind of like backing up even before we go into Luke Acts and just kind of doing a quick review of what are the things that we think you should know, or that will make it easier, or it could be something that we just encounter in the text, like we read a few sentences of Luke and we show how that takes us back to something that started in Genesis. So I'm open to suggestions on what's the best way to do that. So Luke itself is kind of broken up into 3 parts. One of the ways that we know Luke and Acts are internally connected is, even though the author doesn't speak up and say, "Hi, this is Kevin, I wrote these things," or "Hi, I'm Luke." We have 2 dedications to this guy who is named Theophilus. So the book of Luke opens with, basically, and we're going to get into it soon, basically a dedication to this guy named Theophilus. And Acts also begins with mentioning this guy Theophilus. So whether that's a patron or whether that is a stand-in for just someone else who would be reading this. Patron would be someone who basically, back in the day, if you were a scholar or a scientist or some type of philosopher and you weren't already rich, you needed someone to pay for you to do your work. So if you were an artist, if you were a writer, if you were a thinker, you needed someone to basically fund, so you didn't have to go work for a living. You didn't have to work for your bread to basically do all this work.
Perfect transition to support Life to the Full podcast. If this episode resonates with you, consider supporting our work. Your contributions help us create impactful content, grow our community, and reach those seeking healing and deeper spirituality. Thank you for being part of this journey. Together, we're building something transformational. Join us today.
So we have these 2 dedications to Theophilus. So that tells us It's connected. And a lot of people, because this isn't necessarily something that is, pointed out a lot, that these books are connected. Because most people, most I think people in churches, they would just, even if they're aware, okay, these things are connected, they think it's connected more of like, okay, they were written by the same people, but they're two different works. One's a gospel and one is clearly history. And hopefully as we go through it, we'll see it's clearly not history. Luke definitely has a narrative point of view, and he has a reason for writing, and he has a reason for arranging all the things the way he's chosen to arrange them. But if you're not aware of this, and I remember not being aware of this, and reading through the entire Bible for the first time, and then you read through Luke, oh, this guy named Theophilus. You read through John, and then you read through Acts, and you see this name Theophilus again, and you see this dedication to this patron. Hashtag if you'd like to become a patron to what we're doing here. Patty might have more information later on how you can do that. It shocked me. It was like, oh, wait, did anyone else notice this? Did anyone notice these two books are connected? I think I discovered something new, because that's often what happens when you read the Bible in isolation. You think that you're the lone genius that knows everything when you read the text. And then, you go to the internet, you do a basic search, and you go, oh, no, actually, it does seem to be, this is something that people know about. And not a lot of people think it's a big deal. And I really only think really in scholarship, it's become like more of like a big deal that these things are connected. I would say in the last like maybe 20 to 30 years, I know there was some work that was done, because I'm reading some of those works now from 70, even 100 years ago. But it wasn't necessarily like mainstream, where I feel like now, at least in the scholarly communities, most scholars would feel like you need to take Luke and Acts together on their own terms, like they're two parts of one whole. But it's definitely not something that is filtered down into mainstream Christianity. So you have the two Theophilus works, dedications. You have the two Theophilus dedications, and then you have the resurrection kind of right in the middle of Luke and Acts. So Luke ends again with the resurrection, and then Acts kind of backs up, and then it goes through the resurrection again, and then Jesus ascends into heaven, and then the rest of the book proceeds out from there. It's kind of broken up into three parts. We kind of have the Jesus's birth and early life. We have Jesus's ministry in Galilee. We have Jesus in Jerusalem and his death. So we have kind of the book of Acts is broken up into three main sections. You can think of it like that. And coincidentally, or not coincidentally, if you understand what I'm cooking here, Acts is also kind of broken up into three main sections as well. You have the birth of the church. You have Peter in Judea and Galilee, and then you have Paul and his journeys to basically, Rome, right? Paul and all his journeys. So you have kind of three main sections: the birth of the church, Peter and Paul, and in Luke, you kind of have three main sections. So you kind of have, there's definitely some intelligent design here, as we'll see. Like whoever wrote this is kind of cluing you in that there is a grand unified structure here in Luke Acts, which it's kind of cool. Like once you see it, you can't unsee it. Even now, like before I had this idea of doing this class, even just casually going in, you can't help but notice a lot of the ways that Acts is mapped onto Luke and Luke is mapped onto Acts, and both things kind of echo back into the Hebrew scriptures. And so it's fun. It should be a fun time going through all this. All right. And then, so together they make that one big unified whole, and it's helpful. It's informative. And someone say, and I feel like I would say this too, it's necessary to kind of like have both of these texts in mind at the very minimum when you go through it. And then obviously the rest of the Hebrew scriptures as well, because the community that Luke was writing to, right, they had the scriptures, they had the Hebrew scriptures, they already valued those. The first communities were Jewish Christian communities. And yeah, so this is kind of like the grand bird's eye view of Luke and Acts. And yeah, so that's that. that's the end of the first major section there. Maybe it's a good time to pause. This wine glass looks a little too full, so I'm going to take care of that. Patty, any questions, comments, concerns?
Yeah, so I think it's really cool that you were talking about your realization of why this person, what do you pronounce his name?
Theophilus, okay.
Because you don't understand how many times I've ignored this dedication.
Okay.
And to bring it together to actually start paying attention, it's something new. How can we avoid ignoring certain clues that the writers are trying to share with us?
Like, so what context would you'd be encountering this, do you imagine? Like in a Bible study and like your own personal reading?
No, in personal readings, because we already discussed like how we like to chop scriptures up for like our own message. So now that I'm transitioning to actually taking the Bible seriously and what the authors are saying about the whole story and how it connects, so I mean it in a personal time reading.
Yeah, I mean, I think, just reading large sections of text can help. That was kind of my gateway into this. I was reading something in Hebrews about, you've come to a mountain that cannot be touched, sound of a trumpet. And the writer of Hebrews was saying this stuff like everybody should know this kind of stuff. And I was like, I have no idea what he's talking about. Like, and this writer that's in my New Testament is writing these things like I should know. So it prompted me to go all the way back to the beginning and just read through Genesis, read through Exodus. It only really gets difficult the first go around reading through Leviticus. Genesis and Exodus is pretty cool. Numbers is a lot of fun. There's a lot of like fun stuff that happens there. And, Deuteronomy is, like for the first time readers, not as boring as Leviticus, but it's pretty cool. And then you get into, Joshua, you get into Judges, and you get into 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. And so really, I think if you just start by reading large portions of scripture and you give yourself permission to notice things, because I think a lot of times we don't give ourselves permission to notice our own things, have our own encounters with text. We're always either getting it through the lens of we're having a personal devotional. So we're just reading it to like know how to be nicer to our spouse, how to be better parents to our kids, or how to like feel more empowered, versus just encountering these things the way we would have in the wild, like as just story. Let's read it as story. It doesn't have to have the weight of like God's word, or this is like, like what Wu-Tang would say, basic instructions before leaving Earth. Just encountering these things as a story. And if this was a movie I was watching, I would probably notice that both movies are dedicated to the same person, or they have similar opening lines.
That's good. So
Cool.
I'm giving myself permission to notice. Sounds like a really solid advice.
Yeah, giving yourself permission to notice things, and you don't always need permission from like your evangelist or your minister, or actually, I want to back that up. You never need permission from anyone to notice your own things and come to your own conclusions. Which I feel like that's why to me it's so exciting encountering these things in community, where you have a community that values other people's points of view, and I don't have to question whether or not you're a Christian. If you believe differently than me, or you think differently than me, we can just really have like a cool conversation. Like I didn't notice that in the text. Where are you seeing that? And I feel like that's the way, different classes I've been a part of, like in graduate school, that's kind of where more it is. We're all like, oh, wow, I didn't see that in the text. And then like we go and look at it, and maybe at a certain point, it's like, oh, wow, actually you're right. I see it now. It's clearly in the text. And the fun thing about way texts work is that texts don't necessarily operate like math or science. Like there's not always one thing that the text is trying to convey. There's usually like a multiplicity of meanings, which I just recently got a chance to teach middle school English for a while, and that is super fun. And if you ever get a chance to teach middle school anything, I would recommend middle school English, because some of the stuff they get out of the text is just wild, and it's like I never would have seen that in a million years. I'm not saying that I agree with you, but like I see where you could have gotten that from. So it's, I guess, reading these texts like middle schoolers.
So are you saying that in the scholarship world, academia, they're more receptive than our actual local churches?
I would say so, yeah. So you always have the people who.
So what would you say to those who don't feel that they're scholarly, or they're going to go the academia route?
I think that, again, like I was saying earlier, because this is just reading, and it's not like we have to learn like calculus or something like that. I feel like there's a lot of tools that scholars use that are really open to everybody. You don't necessarily need even the biblical languages to go in and start noticing things about text. Like one of the basic like scholarly 101s in like noticing things about text is just noticing similar words and phrases, especially when it comes to the Bible. And so what we just did here is like we basically connected two works that are separated in most Bibles, well, all Bibles, by John, right? There's Luke, and then there's John, and then there's Acts, and we just connected it with two little opening phrases that we can see the author's intent was to connect these works. And that's something that I feel like is open to everybody, yeah. So I think I know scholarship can have a bad rap of like, these are people that don't listen to like common sense, or they don't listen to like what other people are saying, or they think they're better. But I do feel like my experience with like scholarship has been much more open-minded than I would say even in my old like church environment, where when it comes to asking questions of these texts.
That's cool. And I'm glad that you have arrived to a conclusion that you do not need your PhD to teach these things to the public, hence this podcast.
Well, I still want to get my PhD. Just throwing that out there.
You don't need it in order to teach.
You don't necessarily need it, no. And that's something that like it's been an evolving thing, because I have a working knowledge now of Hebrew. I have a rudimentary understanding of Greek. And it's one of those things that I always heard this from people like Tim Mackey that kind of launched me on my whole like journey to wanting to become a PhD, by listening to him and John's The Bible Project podcast, and even getting a chance to take a class with Timmy at the college. Sorry, Tim. Did I just call him Timmy? Tim Mackey and getting to meet him, taking his class on Ezekiel that he did out there a few years ago. I've heard from scholars again and again, you don't need to know the languages. It's great if you can, but you don't need to know the languages. And now that I'm starting to get a mastery over the languages, I still love the languages, but it's definitely not something that you need to start really working with these texts.
Cool. Yeah, I'm asking for those who completely are opposed to academia, like your wife.
Ah, I see. Yeah.
Awesome.
So PhD stands for poor, helpless, and desperate.
No, I'm not going to go that far. I do believe that the next generation of universities are going to be online, where we don't have to pay this ridiculous prices to get educated, and some of this information might be free. And that's the kind of academia scholarship that I'm going to go for. Yeah. And will love to get my quote unquote PhD.
Yeah. And shout out.
State classes.
Yeah, absolutely. And shout out to the Bible Project that does, they're committed to putting out, I think 3 or 4 seminary level classes per year, for free. But the one thing I would say about that is one of the things I've learned, because I've taken everything that the Bible Project puts out, and that's all free. And then I even found an article written by the people at Logos. They have their Bible software, Logos Bible software, where they were like, get a PhD for free. And they had all these like free classes you could take online. There is just something though about the interaction between the other students and the professor. And this is going to sound really weird because nobody I would imagine likes doing this. But for me, the process of writing papers and getting that feedback from another scholar that to me is well worth the price of admission. I learned so much more actually having to, write that paper, because then you have to organize your thoughts. You have to think about how would I explain this. And, so I would say if you get an opportunity to be even in a circle, not necessarily go to grad school, but be in a circle of people that they're actually doing some writing, they're actually doing some thinking, or even some teaching around this stuff. Because if you're a good teacher, you have to write a lot. You have to really organize your thoughts and get all that stuff together. Hey everyone, our podcast is officially back and I'm excited to bring you fresh content as part of my yearly teaching series. This season, we're kicking off with the Winter Gospel series while we're diving deep into Luke Acts. In this week's episode, I explored how Luke and Acts are connected structurally and dig into clues that hint at the identity of the author. It's a fascinating journey through scripture and historical context. Make sure you tune in next week as we take a closer look at what the early church fathers had to say about Luke Acts and some of the sources that might have shaped these writings. New episodes drop every Sunday by 2 p.m. So subscribe now so you don't miss a show. And don't forget, every Wednesday, we're going to be coming live at 7:30.
7 p.m.
At 7 p.m. Central. Wait, where are we? Eastern time, 7 p.m. Eastern time. See you then.